Welcome to Robert Bellissimo at the Movies. This is a vodcast where we explore all things cinema. I want to welcome to the show Brandon Davis, who is the host of the fantastic podcast Front Row Classics Podcast. Brandon, welcome. So great to have you.
Thanks, Robert. Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure is all mine because I've been listening to your show for quite a while, and like I said before we started, we seem to have a lot of the same guests. So anytime I'm researching someone, I'm like, okay, they usually have talked to you before me. So it's a great tool, you know.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. Whenever I have a guest on my show, I always try to see if they did interviews before me, so I can figure out what their interview style is, kind of.
Yeah, but not just from a research point of view. I've really enjoyed your show, and you've had pretty much all the TCM hosts, I believe, except maybe
except Jacqueline, and I'm working on it. So we'll see if that pans out. But I've had Eddie Muller on the most. I try and usually have him on in November for Noirvember.
Right.
But I've talked to Ben a couple of times, and then I've talked to Alicia and Dave. So it's been fun.
Fantastic. Well, for people who haven't seen The Postman Always Rings Twice, or if you haven't seen it in a while, I'll read a short synopsis. A married woman and a drifter fall in love and then plot to murder her husband. This was directed by Tay Garnett. The book was by James M. Cain, and the screenplay was adapted, of course, from the book by Harry Ruskin and either Niven or Niven Busch. I hope I have that right. It starred Lana Turner, John Garfield, Cecil Kellaway, as well as Hume, Cronyn. We also have Audrey Totter has a cameo in it, and Leon Ames or Ames?
Ames.
Ames. Okay, yeah, he's fantastic. All right, great. Well, before we jump into the review, I often ask guests who come on for the first time if it's a noir. What noir? How do they define noir? Because I find people look at noir in different ways and have different ways of defining it. So, for you, what makes a film noir?
For me, what makes a film noir, it's kind of two parts. There's the aesthetic part of film noir, where it's what we think of. It's sort of that, what Hollywood took from sort of the German expressionists. It's, the black and white, the light and shadow. It's certainly that. And it's certainly, most of the time it's a crime story, a private eye story, not always. But for me, at the core of like the story of noir, it's typically good people who get caught up in not so good happenings, plots, schemes, whatever, and the dominoes keep falling, and they get themselves into holes they can't dig themselves out of until eventually they're going to get caught, or something's going to happen. So for me, that's kind of the common thread of most noir. Now, not always. There's always exceptions to every rule, but it's normally, at least one typically good person who finds themselves caught up in a web of just deceit and whatever, and they can't dig themselves out of it.
And it's funny because it's almost silly to ask what makes this film a noir, because it's like what you just described resembles like very much what happens in this film. But what is it about, just for the sake of our review, what is it about this film that rings film noir to you?
Oh, well, you mentioned the book by James M. Cain, and this is the same person who wrote Double Indemnity, who wrote Mildred Pierce, so many other great examples of noir, especially from this period of the mid-40s. And it's got so much. It's got deceit, it's got murder, it's got lust, it's got all of that mixed into one, and you've got the femme fatale character, you've got all of this sort of rolled into one. It takes place in California. We consider LA and Los Angeles, it's one of the quintessential noir cities, and it's got this wonderful Southern California setting as well, and it's people who are wanting to better themselves and get to a certain station in life, but they just go about it totally the wrong way, and they get themselves into such a mess that it's going to all tumble apart on top of them.
Do you remember the first time you saw this and what you initially thought of it?
It was probably, trying to think. I don't know if I saw this one in high school. I must have been in college when I watched this for the first time. But I was a big noir fan, but I like the other two. I'd seen Double Indemnity. I had seen Mildred Pierce. I had seen Laura, which is one of my favorites. I'd seen The Asphalt Jungle, but this was one I sort of came a little bit later to, but I always knew about it, and I loved it right away. I thought it was great, and I thought it was so unusual to come from a studio like MGM,
Right.
which is not known for giving us gritty stories like this. So I love MGM films from that period because I also am a big musical fan, and I love all the movies from that era, and the way that MGM presented them. So I thought, man, this was really unusual, and it was great to see somebody like Lana Turner in a role who didn't always get movies that I thought were worthy of her abilities. And finally, I thought, this is a project that really she could shine in. And then
Yeah.
the chemistry with her and Garfield is so great, and it's always great to see Garfield on screen.
Yeah. Yeah, no, they were fantastic. They were fantastic together, and it's interesting because I was trying to remember when I first saw this film. I remember certain moments on my first viewing, but I can't remember exactly when I first saw it, but it was definitely a while ago. But I never really thought it was that good at first. I sort of thought it was okay, but there was a lot of noir movies I liked a lot more. Sure. And I actually asked, you may have asked Eddie this as well, Eddie Muller. I interviewed him a couple of times last year because he had 2 books out last year. And I asked him if there is a classic noir that he's not crazy about, and he actually picked this movie.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, he's not the biggest fan of it, and so when I went into it again recently, I didn't have high expectations. I also really liked Visconti's adaptation of the book Ossessione. Mm-hmm. It's been a while since I've seen the Rafelson one with Nicholson and Lang, so I can't really comment on that. But when I watched it again, I was like, you know what, I really took to it. I actually thought, you know what, this is actually, at first I thought I was like, you know what, I think it's really good. And then the more it sort of lingered with me, I was like, I in fact think this is like really a great film. I mean, the ways in which they managed also to get around the production code at the time with it. And not only that, but also find a way to almost make it somewhat optimistic at the end, which I'm sure we'll get into, even though it's like the optimism is sort of twisted and maybe warped. And even to sort of, at least I was sort of empathized with them, to both of them, even though they're doing these horrible things. I thought, it's a pretty powerful thing. The only thing when I watched it, because I watched it a couple of times before today, and at first I was a little thrown once we get into the second part with the lawyers. Because right. I it was sort of like, I know someone when you reviewed it, one of your guests said that, and I felt that way at first. Well, it sort of became like procedural at first, but then the more I kind of thought about it and got into it, I'm like, but what's interesting is that those lawyers are almost as bad as them, if not worse to them. And the guy later who tries to blackmail them and everything, and they're very manipulative. And I thought, well, that's very noir. Everyone's out for something, and people don't really feel much for one another. But at least Frank and Cora felt for one another. So I thought it was, really, really powerful. But I know we touched on some of the themes, but what were some of the big takeaways for you about, what is this story getting at? What is it about to you?
Oh, well, first of all, I when you mentioned Eddie, I was like, yeah, I remember him saying he didn't like, that this was one of the ones that he doesn't, relate to as well. And I can see why, because it's for so many of the things we mentioned. I think this is it's sort of a glamour noir. I've heard it referred to. It's not, Eddie's a big fan of movies like In a Lonely Place and Crisscross, right, and movies like that. They're a little more they're a little darker, and not to say that this isn't a dark story, because it is, but you're right. There is kind of a MGM in their typical fashion sort of give it a bit more of a morality. And
Yeah,
so I think that what they're trying to get in this movie is that, it's they weren't really talking about karma in the late 40s, but that's kind of what it is. It's sort
yeah,
of like, uh, being sort of satisfied with, which Garfield toward the end, as we'll talk about, um, really does sort of become content with what his destiny is going to be because of what he did previously, and he realizes he can't. So I think what they're trying to get at is the deeds that you do, as much as you try and cover them up and clean them up, they're always going to come back to you in some way. It's
yeah,
sort of that
exactly. Yeah.
it's sort of that law of physics where whatever you put out is going to come back to you. Everything's going to have a reaction. So, in a way, that's what this movie is really getting at when you look at the denouement at the end of it.
Yeah, well said. That's what I thought too. It's like it's interesting how they really explored that the theme of karma, because it's like whatever what you do now is going to come back and haunt you. And they almost had they hadn't really had a second chance, in the sense
Yeah,
that when they initially tried to kill him, it goes wrong, and then they wind up not killing him, and
right.
they manage to cover it up and get away with it. And then you would think, God, we maybe we shouldn't try this again, but then they do,
They do.
and of course that once they do, there was really no turning back, and as soon as they did it, it wasn't even as though they were on the run or something, or at least got away with it for a while. It was like right away, boom! It just this element of fate
Yeah,
is so interesting, and the fact that they're really sort of chained to one another. I mean, he even says that
yeah.
to her. Frank says that to Cora. And I thought the direction. One thing that I loved about the way it was shot and cut and directed was that they're always in the same frame together.
Mhm.
You only there was only a few instances where I noticed that they're okay. Now they're going for an over the shoulder close up, particularly when they decide the second time to kill Nick.
Right.
Then they were going for close ups. Also later on, after the trial, when they're put in the room together, she's at the window and he's alone, so they separate them. But then she can't even help but feel for him in that moment, even though he's betrayed her. And she takes. I love that little moment where she takes her cigarette and puts it in his mouth. There's all
Right.
these great little details, but they're just, as soon as they meet, they're just two magnets who are absolutely nuts about one another.
Yeah, and eventually, when you're locked together with somebody for too long, even though you might be attracted in the beginning, they eventually resent each other, and it leads to
Right.
that. But then, of course, it comes full circle again, and they end up, in mutual attraction once again. But it's too late by that point. But
Yeah.
but yeah, it really is remarkable, and you just sort of feel from the very beginning when he walks into that lunchroom for the first time and he sees her, you feel that pull from the very beginning, and it never lets go, whether it's love or hate between the two of them. They're sort of destined to be together.
Yeah. Yeah, and from Frank's point of view, I mean, again, classic sort of doom protagonist is that he's totally stuck and trapped because she's married, and then she's resisting him, and then she sort of breaks it off, and he tries in every way to kind of forget about her, and he just can't. So
Yeah,
even if he's there, he's stuck in those moments where he does eventually try to leave,
yeah.
and she's constantly on his mind, right? And I mean, he's trapped, he's glued to her as soon as they met. So I found that sort of dynamic really compelling.
Oh, I think so as well. Yeah, I think that it really, because these are two really, I think what makes it compelling is, first of all, I mean the characters that Cain created, and then what the screenplay sets forth is fine, but the fact that you've got two stars who really, probably in 1946 you wouldn't have suspected to co-star together, when you see Lana Turner and John Garfield, because John Garfield was this very actors, he's pre-Brando. He's got this sort of actor studio mentality to him. He's very method. And Lana Turner, who
Yeah.
is, one of the poster children for the studio system, seeing them together, you wouldn't think necessarily they go together, but it really is a clash of
Yeah.
styles. And that really leads to the tension of the movie. And they bring out such wonderful attributes to each other. And
Yeah.
it's great because you do feel like she's this sort of butterfly who's been pinned to a wall and she's trying to let loose, and he's this sort of drifter who can get her there, but the way that they do it is messy, but definitely, yeah, they both see sort of each other as their ticket to a better life for themselves.
Right. Yeah, it's always interesting when you have two actors from completely different styles, but at the end of the day, as long as they are working with one another,
Yeah,
then and if they're both have good, if they're both talented and have strong abilities, then it really shouldn't matter if they're from two different ways of working. But I think in this case, that's such a good example because they're both really working, off one another, and they're connected. The chemistry is great. I mean, particularly the sexual tension.
oh yeah,
Like she's really trying to resist him, and she can't help it. And one thing I forgot, and maybe because I'm thinking of Double Indemnity, because Stanwyck's character in that is just like pure evil, and I always, one thing I remember, that everybody remembers about this film, of course, is the iconic way in which we meet Lana Turner. In the short shorts with the lipstick and the white turban, and she's like a goddess, right? She's stunning, and it's very, very femme fatale. And for some, again, because I hadn't seen it in a while, and I had thought that the character was like the Stanwyck character in Double Indemnity, but she's actually really not. Like, she is like a pretty decent person who's just trying to, she's ambitious.
yeah.
She's trying to run this restaurant. And she doesn't want an affair, right? And actually, he's the one who's going after her. And what's interesting is that he's really arrogant about it. Like, as soon as he gets hired, he kisses her after his first day. He grabs her for a kiss. And then there's that scene where they're dancing, and he's dancing right in front of Nick. Her husband, and just the way in which he's looking at her, he doesn't care that Nick is watching. He's sort of really cocky. So in some ways, he's really the catalyst of all of their problems,
Oh yeah, and I think we mentioned it in the episode that we did about this a couple of years ago, where so much happens in the first 10 minutes of the movie. It's it just happens at warp speed. Garfield enters the restaurant, he meets Nick, he gets the job, he meets Cora, they fall in love. It's all happening within the first 10 minutes of the movie. And then, after that, so much happens in the hour and 50 minutes of this movie. After that, you feel like you've seen about 10 different movies. But yeah, it's great. And you're right about the difference between Cora and Phyllis Dietrichson in Double Indemnity, because Phyllis is out to murder her husband right away, and she's out to get the money.
Whereas it's totally calculated.
Whereas Cora just wants a better life, and if there was a way outside of doing away with Nick, she would take it, and she does. She wants to run away with him at one point without bothering Nick whatsoever. So there's more, I guess you could say, genuine motives on the part of Cora, whereas Phyllis immediately is after the money and wants to off her husband. And I think, and partly that, and maybe it's just the way that they're portrayed in the movies, but the couple of times you meet Phyllis's husband in Double Indemnity, he does seem like an awful human being, whereas Nick never comes across as that awful. But you can see why Cora and him don't necessarily fit together, and why their life together isn't great. But he doesn't seem like all that bad of a guy. So that really is the main difference there, and that's why I think Cain why these two stories have sort of their own divergent trails in the end, because there really are the bad motives that there are in Double Indemnity aren't there at the beginning of Postman. Yeah,
because she's much more torn. It's like she she doesn't want anything to do with him because that's going to ruin her ambition. And, and money and ambition is a big thing in noir. Is, people are really out of greed or, a question of morals. And she doesn't want to ruin that, but now she really loves Frank. So she decides to go with him. But then, of course, before you know it, she just thinks we got to go back because, this is going to, the reality sets in, you're going to be, she feels as though, she knows he's smart, but he doesn't necessarily have the means to make a lot of money. And she's just like, I got to have a good life. I got to run this restaurant. And they go back. And I love that moment where they get there before Nick does. And then they see him driving back and he nearly gets into a car accident. And Frank says, oh, God, yeah. And then he goes, if only he got hit and he'd be dead. That's not the exact line, but something like that. And Cora's almost disturbed by the thought of that. And what I love so much about this film, and that's such a noir theme, is going into those sort of really dark instincts that we sort of all have. I mean, we all get into like positions where we're really in a bind, and we sometimes kind of do think, if only this person would just be out of the way, right? So this sort of really dives into that, and what happens when you follow those really darker sides of ourselves. I don't know if that popped out to you at all, but
I think so too, because I think that all of us as humans have had unsavory, thoughts every now and then. What if, this bad thing happened to this person? Maybe something would, something would turn out better for us. I think it's only humans sometimes to think that, most of us probably wouldn't then concoct a plan to then off that person or whatever.
Right.
But no, I think that is definitely a major theme in this, is that if you tap into the darker side of yourself too much, then bad things are going to happen and consequences will then be forced upon you after that. So, definitely. It's definitely a theme that permeates throughout all of this. And it's interesting that it is Garfield who's the first one who gets that. And that's what differentiates it between Double Indemnity as well, because McMurray's the one who has to be pulled along by Stanwyck, whereas in this one, Garfield kind of pulls Turner into it. She's the one that ends up with the egg on her face most at the end, but it really is him who's the catalyst at the beginning.
No, he plants that seed, even though even though she's the one that really pushes it, and then he's sort of like, really, but he goes along with it because he's so desperate to be with her and to have what he wants. But I found that I really found that interesting, because one thing that's a real big part of noir is people doing something wrong, but they know what they're doing is wrong. But they're still doing it because they need to, and their desire is just so strong that they're willing. They're absolutely willing to destroy themselves, but they're not evil. I mean, they're doing evil things, but they're sort of conscious of like, God, this is terrible, but it's the only way, or the only way they think they can do it. Get the restaurant, get Nick out of then they have everything, the love and the ambition.
Yeah, because when you are that desperate, it's like you have blinders on and you can only see the one option. You can't see that there's 4 other options maybe out there that you could try, but you're just seeing that one, because Cora and they are Cora and Frank, they are so blinded by their lust for each other in the beginning that it seems like getting Nick out of the picture is the only way to take care of this, but they don't spend the time to maybe see some of the more logical, reasonable, moral ways they could go about this.
Right. And, I thought Nick, at first I thought, I mean, it's sort of odd that Nick wouldn't be suspicious. I mean, he's a pretty secure character. He's got like this most, like, one of the most beautiful women like ever as his wife. And then this guy who's clearly hanging, like taking her to the beach, dancing with her. And he's like, yeah, go ahead. No problem. But I mean, I think partly he's pretty foolish. I mean, for one thing, he's drinking and driving.
Yeah.
And secondly, I think he just has a massive ego. And I mean, some people can be like that. They're sort of delusional to think, oh, she'll never cheat on me, you know. And even the fact that he just thinks that she'd go along with moving to Canada to take care of his sister, who's now sick. I just thought, you know, I can see how some people would maybe find that hard to believe, but in a way, it is very kind of believable that someone could be that dumb.
Yeah, well, and that to me, that's the one point where I'm like, Nick, are you serious? Because I'm like, it's his sister who is sick, and yet he expects this wife of his to be the one to take care of her. And I'm like, what a miserable existence that would be for Cora. And you know, it really is. Yeah, it's remarkable. And I also think that maybe part of the reason he doesn't think he'll lose her to Frank is, you know, he owns this stable business, he's got the money, whereas Frank, you know, like we've established, his feet are always itching. He moves wherever sort of the He won't be around for long, and Nick is going to be the stable option for Cora. So I think he's probably banking on that as well.
Right. Well, so perhaps in a sense that maybe I'm not giving him I'm not giving him enough credit because I think he was wise enough to know that perhaps that her ambition is stronger than any other guy, right? So it's like, you know, I've got the money, you don't.
Probably.
You know, which is interesting, which is, you know, I sort of really liked his character. And I forget who plays him, but I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's
Cecil Kellaway.
Yeah, Cecil. I mean, I must have seen him in other things. Just nothing's ringing a bell. But he's a really good actor.
Oh yeah, a fantastic character actor. One of my favorite performances of his is 20 some years down the road, but he plays Father Mike in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn's best friend is the priest. Who's the one who approves of their daughter's relationship with Sidney Poitier from the very beginning, and he's incredible in that. And so I mean but you know, he's in Wuthering Heights, he's in Gunga Din, you know, he's in The Letter with Bette Davis. He racked up so many performances. But just one of those really stable character actors of that time who always brings such pathos into whatever he does.
Well, and I love that scene with the three of them when Nick, you know, he initially tried to leave and he finds his way back there. Mm-hmm. And then they're all together, and you know the scene we just mentioned where he says, "Okay, we're moving to Canada," and I actually thought Turner acted that beautifully. The way she was like, "You cannot sell this place," you know, like she looked like she was going to kill him right there. Mm-hmm. But it was, you know, you could really feel her rage. I remember once I think it must have been maybe a documentary or something on John Garfield, and Joanne Woodward was talking about how great Garfield is in this. Yeah. And he said, and then she said, "Oh, well," she goes, "Lana Turner's much more theatrical." And I thought, really? But then there were a few moments, like when she was getting angry, like when they're in the room after the trial, and she's getting mad at Frank. I did think it felt a little pushed and a little over the top a little bit. It sort of wasn't right from her gut, you know, really sort of real. Whereas Garfield's totally he doesn't have a false note. I mean, the guy was incredible. Right. But apart from that, I didn't think that she was really theatrical at all.
Oh, I think this is her best moment, finest moment on the film. I think the only time she was nominated for an Oscar was for Peyton Place about probably a decade after this, and she's good in that. But I think she's better in this. And you know, I think she was always a better actress than people gave her credit for. Yeah. You know, she's one of those beauties from the 40s who just never really got the credit or sometimes material she deserved. Yeah. But she is really, really good in this. And I think
I agree.
And because she has such an arc, you know, she can go from being this sort of, you know, very tempting femme fatale to being this sort of dominated wife who's trying to get out of this cage she's been put in, to being this would-be murderess, to being this that where she goes to take care of her sick mother. There's just so many different facets of Turner in this movie, and I think she hits them all really, really well. And yeah, she plays so much of it so perfectly. And you're right, certainly there's some scenes where it's going to be really over the top and theatrical, but even some of the best actresses at that time were that. It was just the style of the time.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think she was better than maybe people think. And you look later, like Bad and the Beautiful. She's fantastic.
That's another great one.
Yeah, I recently saw, because one of my I have a Patreon membership, and one of the tiers is what I call neo noir or not, sort of playing with Eddie Muller's Noir or not. Yeah. So sort of looking at like the post 60s, like what makes a movie like a neo noir, because it's sort of a little less defined than perhaps the classic period. And one of the films I put on the list was Portrait in Black with her and Anthony Quinn. It's a very similar story, but much more in a good, and I'm not saying melodramatic out of a criticism, because I actually really love melodrama, but it's much more melodramatic, but she's also fantastic in it. So if you ever get a chance, check that one out.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, there's nothing wrong with good melodrama. And she's great in, the Douglas Sirk's Imitation of Life, in the late 50s. And she did some great work at MGM in movies like Green Dolphin Street. And I also loved her in as Lady de Winter in The Three Musketeers that she did just a year or two after this.
I haven't seen that.
Yeah, she's a really solid villainess in that film. Yeah, so she she really really did some good work.
I wanted to touch on the lawyers a little bit, because I love Hume Cronyn. Fantastic.
He's great.
And Leon Ames, he was great. That he is real. He's another character actor who he's a familiar face. I know I've seen him in other things, but man, I think he's fantastic. He's totally real on camera. I think Cronyn as well.
Yeah. Leon Ames is really, really good in this. And
sorry, Ames. I think I said Amos. Ames, sorry.
He probably most famous for playing Judy Garland's father in Meet Me in St. Louis just a couple years before this.
Oh, okay. I've seen that once, but it's been a little while. But yeah,
which totally different type of movie, totally different performance. But yeah, he's another one of those character actors who could do anything, but you really feel like he's a district attorney from LA. He feels so real and so natural, and his line readings are so great. And you just know that from the very beginning, that he's going to catch these two eventually, and he's going to do it somehow. Even when you logically you may think, oh, Hume Cronyn's got him figured out, with this plea bargain and the signed confession that he's hidden away and everything. You think, oh, he's not going to get them at this point. But then, eventually he does. He turns around and he does it. But he's so good and he's so knowing, and he plays it. He doesn't play it over the top or anything. It's just very matter of fact and underplayed. And it's so good. And then Cronyn, like you talked about, he's just your perfect example of a shyster lawyer who is so fantastic. And he plays it a little bigger than the way Leon Ames plays it, but it doesn't come off that way. It's it's so perfect. And he's got that little section of the movie that he's in, like right in the middle, he steals it. I mean, it almost becomes his movie. It's not Garfield and Turner's.
Yeah.
But yeah, and that's what I love about these movies from this era too, is that these character actors can come on and just take the little bits that they have and make it their own movie.
Right. Well, who Leon Ames plays, Kyle Sackett, he's one of the few characters in this film that's like he's a pretty decent person for the most part. And the only thing that I did think that was sort of where even his morals come into play is that he's the classic noir character who has a hunch, so he's going on a hunch. He followed them right before they commit the crime, but he did not see them, right? So he can't he can't really, and he knows he can't prove it. So, what does he do? He finds a way to manipulate them both to get them. We don't have to go into all the details of that because it's really something people should see because it's quite clever and even humorous. But I thought, well, this is interesting because here's a guy who's going up purely on a hunch, and I thought you really want to, even though he's right, we know he's right, but I'm like, do you really want to put these people away or have them go into the electric chair or on a hunch? But it sort of makes you wonder if this is just about winning a big case, because you see even with Hume Cronyn's character, they have this rivalry and he just really wants to beat Kyle, and that's what it's all about. And even at the end when he goes, they bet $100, on the trial, and then he shows Lana Turner and John Garfield. He's like, I'm gonna hang this, for him. And I just thought, man, these guys are pretty slimy in a lot of ways. Was that? I don't know if that was your impression.
Oh, no. I agree. I think they are slimy, and I think that that's what is so great, and that's another thing that makes this a noir. Nobody in this movie, nobody comes out of it without some sort of blood on their hands. I mean, even the people who are somewhat seen as maybe the good guys, they do some dirty deeds in the back room as well. And so I think that's
exactly
great. And it's and you're right. I think they're all fantastic because even Nick, who can kind of be seen as maybe one of the protagonists of the movies too, he's not the most shining example of humanity either at times, even though I don't think he's a bad guy. But that's the great thing about noir is nobody really is quote unquote good.
Right. Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I know we touched on the style of the film, but you're right. It is. I mean, MGM did it. It's only really in the past couple of years where I started to really pay attention to like, okay, who's the studio? Because that was something I didn't really pay as much attention to but as I've learned more over the years, I'm like, oh yeah, the studios really had a sort of brand, and they made certain kind of movies. And like you said, MGM were like glamour, and musicals and stuff. Like they did not, they did not do this kind of thing. So I'm surprised that it was them. But you're right, the photography is mostly. A lot of it is in the day. We don't have the German expressionistic style. It's not stylized. It's much brighter. The only time where, for me, there really was some shades of the German expressionism is when Nick first sees, the classic scene of first seeing Cora. And I noticed that when the camera is behind Nick, the reflections, I imagine from the window, are bars on his back, from the curtains, I guess. And there's a very similar shot in when we first see Fred McMurray meet Stanwyck, in the sense that as soon as the same thing, the bars are right over, are like covered over him. It's like, boom, now you're trapped as soon as you lock eyes. Of course, at the end, we see that with Nick too, because of course he's in prison, so it's reflected on his face. But for the most part, it's not that dark, but still, I still thought it looked great, but it's, they did kind of lighten it up.
Yeah. And then most of some of the other evening scenes, are of course like the scenes of them on the beach, but those are very romantic. They're sensual. Right. It's not necessarily this grittiness that you expect from a typical film noir, but also, some of the other shots like that stand out to me are like during the first murder attempt when she's going to try and clunk him on the head and the cat gets on the gets on the wire and the electricity gets messed up. Those are some very well shot, very tight, constructed scenes. That's a wonderful suspenseful moment. And this movie was directed by Tay Garnett, like you had mentioned before, who is not a name. He's not known like Alfred Hitchcock or Orson Welles or Billy Wilder or any of those people in the upper echelon, but he did some fine, he did movies like China Seas with Jean Harlow and Clark Gable, and he did Mrs. Parkington with Greer Garson. So he was a very stable director for MGM. He could just take what they assigned him and tell it well and do it. But he really shows some really wonderful visual moments in this movie, and he really shows you that he's got his own point of view in some ways, because he really constructs scenes in a very specific way that, Wilder doesn't in Double Indemnity, or Otto Preminger doesn't in other noirs. So it really is interesting to see him take this material and sort of make it his own, because it makes this movie very sort of singular.
Yeah, I was looking up his filmography, and I wasn't too familiar with him. And often, as I'm sure whoever the director of some of these film noir movies were, they often then did other film noir films. And in this case, the only thing I saw that was film noir related after was like he directed a couple of episodes of The Naked City, which is like TV noir, of course, of spin-off of the film. And the DOP, Sidney Wagner, same thing. Like, he was not a noir, photographer, but I thought, again, I still thought it was quite good and quite interesting the way they did it. And the screenwriters too were not kind of crime writers or did these kind of things. Harry Ruskin and Niven Busch. Same thing. I was looking at their filmographies. So yeah, I mean, I could see. I don't know the book. I haven't read the book, but I'm reading the book is pretty gritty, and then they have like there's like a sadomasochistic relationship between Cora and Frank, and it's much it's much darker. So yeah, I mean, obviously they couldn't do that at the time, but they did find a pretty interesting way to adapt it while still being dark, but having some sort of the core of the love story be quite sort of strong, and you feel for them. I mean, I thought that was pretty. You got to put your hats off to them on that. Oh. I thought.
Well, and they really do, and you've already mentioned it, but they really do skirt around the production code,
right?
Very, very well.
Really well.
Places, I mean, a plot point that you do have to get across is her getting pregnant, and they sort of they sort of marry them off very quickly, and you almost forget that they're married at the point where she tells you he's pregnant, and it's almost like that's not even a plot point that's really in your mind anymore. So they really did sort of skirt around that a little bit, and there's so many other things, but both of these people do end up paying for their crimes at the end, which was a condition of the production code as well.
Right. I can't help but, one thing I never knew about the production code. I only recently, there's a new book out called, you may have heard of it, called The Naughty Bits by Nat Segaloff. Who's written so many books in the last couple of years that he's come on my show like 6 times in a year. Really, really nice guy. And he wrote, and it's all about, it's a bunch of movies and what the production code, what they had problems with and what they made them change. And it's really, really interesting. And one thing that I didn't know was that the films had to even get the wardrobe approved. So, I mean, obviously certain things I knew, like there couldn't be nudity, but I didn't know it had to be, and not revealing, but I didn't realize that they had to even look at that. So how they got Lana Turner short shorts, those are pretty short. I wonder how they got that through.
Yeah, and her bare midriff. I mean, she's not wearing much in that very first. But speaking about her wardrobe, I'm like, it's interesting when I watch this. I'm like, she's in white most of the time, but then she wears black in very specific moments. She wears black when she's getting off the train after her mother passes away. She wears black when she's about to take the knife and kill herself. So there's specific moments where they dramatically change her look, but most of the time she's in just different shades, different forms of white.
Right. I don't know if this was in the book, but it almost seems as though she's punished for being seductive because she dies when she's seducing him, right? And that's a very, you can't help but wonder if that's a very production code kind of thing. Like, look what you've done. How dare you? Even though Nick is like the catalyst mostly, but obviously he pays as well. But even the way because I read anyways that the Postman Always Rings Twice, like the people have different interpretations of what that metaphor can be. And Cain made different comments that sort of suggests what he was thinking. But in the film, they kind of spell it out it's it's sort of a metaphor, but it's pretty interesting how, Frank is going to die, and he's guilty of killing her, and
Right.
he is freaking out. He's like, I didn't do it. And then the way in which the lawyer, because now he has the hard evidence that he also killed Nick with Laura. We don't have to go into all the details of that. People can see it, but and he says to him, hey, if we don't get you now, I got the evidence right here from this letter that Cora wrote, that you did it. So it's like you're gonna die anyways. And in a warped way, he sort of convinces himself, and he's happy. Oh, well, at least I'm not going to die for killing Cora. And of course, that metaphor of it's like when you're looking forward to a great letter, and the postman comes, and he always rings a second time, because you'll always hear it the second time, no matter where you are. And so it's ringing twice for him, it's ringing twice for Laura. And I thought that's pretty warped. And the way he's sort of convincing himself that he's not dying for killing her. Not that he didn't kill her. It was a car accident, but they, of course, that's what the lawyer went with and won on. But it's pretty interesting that he would find some almost sense of redemption in himself, or sort of. I think he's also willing to die, because I think he feels pretty guilty, and but at least he's not dying for Cora. So I thought, I don't know how you felt just about that last scene, but I thought it's sort of interesting what they did there.
Yeah, and that to me is the most MGM part of the movie to me, I think.
Yeah.
Because I certainly put this in the noir category, but I like what we talked about at the beginning with Eddie not really embracing this movie. I can see why sometimes it's not put in the canon, because the way that it ends is, it feels like, if you didn't know what was happening, it feels like it's ending on such an optimistic, redemptive note, because
Right.
there's such a smile on Garfield's face as it, and it's a close up of him. And it kind of just ends. It ends very quickly, almost too.
Yes.
It doesn't really give the viewer of the movie time to breathe a whole lot at the end. But no, it really is interesting, because I think that's kind of what makes it less noir, maybe, because it doesn't end sort of ironically. Well, it is ironic, but it doesn't end sort of grittily. I mean, the fact that he is accepting his fate so heartily, I think, is so interesting. I mean, it feels, if you were to ask me maybe what might not work for me at some point, I think that little bit at the ending feels kind of forced, because
a little bit,
because I think up to that, with Leon Ames and John Garfield and with the priest, I think it's played wonderfully. But the way that he just accepts everything so quickly, to me, especially since he's the one who instigated all of this in the first place, doesn't necessarily ring true all the time when you watch it. You kind of have to put that sort of suspension of disbelief in your head when you watch it to accept it a little bit too. Like I said, Garfield, it's written on the page, so Garfield's just doing what's written, and he plays it wonderfully well, like he always does everything.
Yeah, really good, yeah.
But yeah, it's just one of those little things where maybe they could have given us just another little scene or something so that we could see it all sink in, instead of him accepting it all right away.
And it's also interesting that he got, he gets him, finds him finds a way to find him to prove that he did it. Whereas it's ironic, because the first time he also didn't have any proof, and he winds up innocent. So you can't help but wonder, why did Hume Cronyn not really get him out of this? I mean, we only see very little of that trial, right? So it's sort of wrapped up. I don't know. Have you ever read the book? I haven't read the book.
I have not. I
okay.
Need to.
Yeah, it would be interesting to read the book. I think the book ends just with the accident. I could be wrong. If anyone's watching and knows, comment and let us know. But I'm not sure. But it is sort of. I think you're right in the sense that they sort of they sort of sped it up, right? So it's and even though I like the way it felt because it kind of really makes you feel for them, and I think that appealed to me. But in a way, it's sort of not it's forced, not the most believable. So hard to explain.
I think what I feel like is it tries to paint them as these sort of angelic characters, which they never were. So right. I think that's what it's trying to do. But now you mentioned Hume Cronyn. I'm like, maybe Hume Cronyn just isn't effective without his cronies, because Garfield's beating them all up at this point.
Right, the guy who blackmailed, the blackmailer. That was a whole other thing with the guy who comes to blackmail them and everything. And it's certainly got its twists and turns.
And I love seeing that character Kennedy played by Alan Reed, because Alan Reed, who is the voice of Fred Flintstone. So every time he's on screen,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so every time he's on screen, I just hear Fred in my head.
Oh, that's funny. I didn't know that.
But no, he's but you're right. And like I mentioned before, this movie has got so many different twists and turns, and so much happens in less than 2 hours, where if you walk out of the room to go to the restroom, 5 minutes, you miss so much.
Oh yeah. No, you certainly would. It's not only strong on character, but also strong on plot. It's a thick plot with strong characters, character driven. But I also found it interesting that when she finds out that, we see Audrey, Totter has that little cameo, and at this point their marriage is a little rough, and so Nick decides to go have this affair, and she finds out about it. And this was something I thought was really appealing, because she has this mixed feelings about it, where she wants to turn him in about Nick to get back at him, because she's cleared because she got the manslaughter, so they can't open that charge up on her again, but they can for Nick. So she basically says, "I'm going to turn you in for cheating on me," but then she's pregnant, so and at the same time loves Frank, so she has these mixed feelings about it, because then she said, "Well, I can't turn you in because I love you," and she tests him. I love that you mentioned the beach. She goes and swims way out in the beach.
Oh yeah,
and as a way to see, okay, well, if I'm not going to be able to swim back since we went this far, so if you allow me to die now or kill me now, then I know you don't love me. But if you save me, then I know you do. And I mean, that's a pretty melodramatic action. But again, that's not to criticize it, because I thought it's the root of the feelings in it, that she was willing to sort of die at that moment. Like, she could not turn him in, but how could she trust him? Well, if I give him the opportunity to kill me and he doesn't, then I can trust him. And I thought that was pretty interesting. I don't know how you felt about that.
Oh no, yeah. Oh, I think that absolutely is. Yeah, that's one of the most interesting aspects of the movie. I mean, it's just it's that wonderful little bit of character development that the movie gives us, and not every noir gives you that. And so I think it's cool, because we see so many different colors of these two characters.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Well, was there any trivia on this that you found that you thought was worth mentioning?
I mean, I think it's interesting because, this book comes out, I believe it's 1934. And so Hollywood had wanted to, I know that this had been bandied about being filmed for a long time, but the book is released the year the Hays Code comes into effect. So they really had their hands tied, I think, by really trying to make it into something filmable. So it took about a decade for them to get this going. And I know that I think I read in an interview somewhere that when someone brought up Postman to Betty Davis, and she said, "Oh yeah, I was under consideration for that," and they were kind of surprised by that. Well, she wasn't under consideration for it during this period when Lana Turner got it. She was under consideration for it a decade ago.
Oh, right.
In the 30s, when they had thought about filming it. So that's interesting, just how long it was in development. But no, I think that it really, what fascinates me is that a studio like Warner Brothers, not Warner Brothers, a studio like MGM really
Yeah,
decided to back this. And it, of course, a few years later, they also did the Asphalt Jungle. And so they were taking a little bit more risk at the time. And I think that's because Louis B. Mayer at this point was starting to lose power a little bit. I think after World War II, MGM's profits were not what they were, pre
right,
World War II and during the war. So they were trying to do more, dabble into more different genres and trying to see what would stick or whatever. So you would get a movie like this occasionally, but no, I just think it's fascinating. And it's interesting, as I said at the beginning, to see these two people in this movie together, because they were such different styles. And it's always fascinating to see Garfield on the screen because he's someone we didn't get enough of, unfortunately. But
yeah,
every
yeah,
movie that he's in is just a nice little jewel, whether it's this or, Gentleman's Agreement or Humoresque or whatever else, he did. But no, it's just remarkable. And it's so great to see these two sort of at the peaks of their powers.
yeah. No, I completely agree. Was there anything about the film you wanted to mention? Anything else you wanted to before we wrapped up? Or
I'm trying to think. There were, because we mentioned, I think Audrey Totter is great, in that
yeah,
little section, because she doesn't have much dialogue, and that's another wonderful production code aspect. By this time they are married, I believe, and he totally has an affair.
yeah,
And that's something that the Hays Code doesn't allow, but they skirt
right,
around it because you don't really know for sure what's going on. And then Lana Turner, of course, later on infers what happens. But no, Audrey Totter is great in that scene, and she makes her mark, without saying hardly anything. And she and Garfield have sort of a different kind of heat. It's you sort of feel the same sort of combustion of when he first meets Lana Turner, but it's different. But no, it's great. And this movie just permeates with wonderful little performances. But no, I think, yeah, it's a very different noir. It's done in a lot of light, and it's done with a little bit more morality than I think we're used to seeing in noirs and everything. But
right,
not all of it works, but I think just enough of it works to really make it a classic. I mean, I
yeah,
think that it is, whether you want to accept it as a true noir or not. I don't think you can doubt that it's a well-made, well-crafted
right,
movie.
yeah. I completely agree. Can you tell us a little bit about your podcast?
Yeah, Front Row Classics podcast. I started it back in 2015, so it'll be about a decade and another year from now. So that's crazy, but I did it. I usually released about one a month, and then once the pandemic hit, was really when the podcast actually took off, around sort of late 2020. And so now I do it weekly. Sometimes if I have a lot of books to review, or if I have a lot of guests to come on, sometimes I'll release two in a week. It just depends. But you can find us wherever you find your podcasts, on whatever platform. Just search Front Row Classics podcast. But the majority of the episodes are me and a guest discussing a movie like we've done, or I'll be interviewing either a historian, an author who loves classic Hollywood, or sometimes I'm fortunate enough to interview somebody who was there or who was related to somebody from this era. So yeah, just keep on the lookout. I always have something interesting going on.
Great, fantastic. And if people want to follow you on social media, where's the best place to go?
I am on Facebook at Front Row Classics Podcast. I am on Instagram at FRN Classics Pod. I am on Twitter, or X, whatever you want to call it, at FRN Classics. And if you want to contact me, my email address is classicsfrn@gmail.com.
Great, great. Well, I will put all of those, the link to your podcast and website and social media handles in the description box below. And check out Brandon's show. It's really, really great. I've listened to many episodes and highly recommend it. So, Brandon, thanks again, and come again sometime soon.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. This was a pleasure.
Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I want to thank all of my members on Patreon. If you're interested in becoming a member of my Patreon, head over to the link, patreon.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies for full details. Patreon is exclusive content that I create month in and month out. And as a subscriber, you are able to vote on polls and contribute to what I do on Patreon month in and month out. So head over to the link for full details. You can also leave a donation directly to my YouTube channel by pressing the thanks link, which you will find directly below the video frame. Just click on the thanks link and you can leave a donation there if you choose to. And lastly, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing. It is absolutely free to do so by pressing the Robert Bellissimo at the movies logo. You will see it floating above my head in the top left corner to your top left. In just a second, just click on that and then click the bell in order to get a notification every time I release one of my new episodes. Also click the like button and leave a comment below. Let me know what you think of this episode. Also, you can also share the episode. All of these things are what produce traction to my YouTube channel. So I appreciate you watching and thank you again. And I will see you in the next episode.